Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us today as we talk about the problem of homelessness. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom. I'm your host for today. My name is Simon, and you are joining me for the July 2019 opinion article. The article is called Facing the Tough Issues of Life, and it's a 3-day article. This is the 3rd day. And over the course of the article, we've looked at 3 different lessons dealing with different tough issues. The first one was issues surrounding parenting and child raising. The second one, I can't remember. So I'm going to ask my panelists to tell us about it. Our first panelist today is Zach Mills. Welcome back.
Glad to be back.
Zach, tell us, what did we talk about the second day?
So day 2 of our article, we were talking about loneliness. And we were kind of talking about, well, the subtitle was the new heart disease. So on one hand, there is this real serious physical not just physical, but just harm that goes into being alone and not having the choice about the matter.
Good stuff. It's good to have you back with us, Zach. Our third panelist today is Gabriel Harbour. Gabe, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. And Zach, I'm so glad to spend day 3 with you guys on this opinion lesson or this opinion series. And today we're talking about homelessness. I love that it's called the tough issues of life, facing the tough issues of life. And there's so many other tough issues that come to mind besides parenting and loneliness and homelessness, like, I guess peer pressure, the education system, like just a lot of stuff that we could talk about. But these are some important topics that we've decided to focus in on.
Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Because the first article kind of dealt with the idea of how to deal with family in a good way. And then the second one kind of looked at how to deal with the people around you who might be feeling isolated. And this one kind of deals with bigger social issues that you might see in your community. So An interesting pattern we've been following over these 3 days. Again, listeners, the article today is called Want to End Homelessness? Start with Recovery. Title kind of gives us a hint at what the writer is saying the big problem with homelessness is. What is that hint?
Okay, well, first of all, that word recovery, it could mean you're recovering from a wound or an illness of some kind. That's often how we use it when someone is sick and they're in the hospital. They're going through recovery right now. But I think the idea here is another definition, and that has to do with someone who maybe was an alcoholic or someone who dealt with some big problem in their life that now they're trying to recover from or get over.
That's right. And so often we're talking about addiction when we use this word recovery. Now, to be clear, this is an opinion piece, and the opinions expressed in it are not totally those of Advanced Studio Classroom. We're presenting you with a range of different articles by different writers on different topics. And so we're going to discuss our opinions of this writer's piece today. But the second thing is that, to be clear, we're not necessarily saying that everyone who is homeless is struggling with issues of addiction and recovery. I'm sure there are many different reasons people decide to be homeless and many different situations they find themselves in.
That's
but
right.
Nonetheless, you can't deny that there is clearly a role of addiction in many people's homelessness. Right, Zach?
That's right. And, you might be asking yourself, well, I'm not homeless, or it's not even a problem that I'm confronted with on a daily basis. And so how do I relate to this article, or what can I glean? And I think I'm glad that Gabe said what he said about, there are other problems afoot, or about when it comes to homelessness, and that the road to recovery might be the solution. And so homelessness, on one hand, is a problem, but it's actually sometimes people's solution to other problems. That there are these, now it might not be the right solution, right? But nonetheless, that there are these other things afoot, and it's important to know what is going on even below the surface of just being homeless.
Well, you kind of hinted around this idea that maybe some of our listeners are asking, what does this have to do with me? Because in the first two parts of this article, a lot of people are parents. A lot of our listeners are parents. And if not, a lot of them will be at some point. So that has a direct effect on your life. And almost all of us have felt lonely or know someone who is chronically lonely. So again, the second article was closely related. But this question of homelessness, a lot of our listeners might be saying, I don't know any homeless people. I'm not becoming homeless. What does this have to do with me?
Sure.
When I was in university, I spent a couple of years volunteering with an organization that worked with homeless people. Mm-hmm. And the big lesson I learned from that experience didn't actually have too much to do with homelessness. The big lesson I actually learned was that problems that people have, whether homelessness or other problems, can be very, very complicated. We often like to think of them as being simple things that can be fixed with one quick change or one, giving someone a little more money or getting them a house. But often things are so much more complicated than that. I think that's really the lesson that we can pull from this article today, too.
So, Simon, some people say, don't give a man a fish so that he can eat for a day. You want to teach the man to fish so that he can eat for a lifetime. But you're saying the problem might be even more complicated than just teaching someone right skills.
Well, I'm not committing to how complicated or what way things are complicated in. I'm just saying usually when people have problems, those things are much more complicated than we think they are when we first hear about it, And so it's something we want to keep in mind when we deal with these questions, especially when we're talking about homelessness that is related to addiction and recovery.
Probably a good thing to keep in mind when we start to consider possible solutions or what the road to recovery may look like or how long it even is.
Yeah, so that brings us to our first reading for today. We're actually going to have a look at the left-hand column in your Advanced magazine. If you have your magazine with you, we're looking at July 17th. It's on page 28 of the magazine, and we're going to get into that reading now.
Want to end homelessness? Start with recovery. James Randall joined the Army at 18, was deployed to the Middle East, and came home an alcoholic. His addiction led to his being discharged not only from the Army, but into the streets. He was homeless for 2 years, sometimes in a drug-induced psychosis, and was arrested more than 20 times. After his last arrest, he chose to go to King County Regional Veterans Court, which required that he be in treatment. Only then did the idea of recovery cross his mind. It had to be my choice, Randall said, of going into treatment, but the resources had to be offered. Finding a better way. That should give all of us pause. Seattle is a city in crisis, and we are raising millions upon millions of dollars to end homelessness. But I worry that our focus is too much on buildings and not enough on rebuilding lives. My hope is that when all the money is being dispersed, a good chunk goes to treatment services. Give people a sense of community. Show them the potential they gave up long ago. Don't just put them in a room and think the problem is solved.
So as we begin this article, I think we should just first give a note to you, our listeners, that we're talking here specifically about homelessness in an American setting or an American context. And, any country you go to, any place you go to that has an issue with homelessness, I know in Taipei City, where I live, people have talked a lot about the homelessness problem over the last few years. But in any different place where you're talking about homelessness, you're often talking about very different causes and roots and even different types of people who are homeless. And our story today starts out with a military veteran, which is actually a pretty common story in American homelessness, right? And I think one of the big reasons for that is that sometimes in Asia, when people join the military, they don't join to do it for their entire career. They join to do it for a few years, whereas in the West, often people are, doing that for their job, and then they find themselves out of the military and, have a hard time adjusting.
Sure.
And some of that perhaps is due to their war experiences and things that happened to them during the war, or maybe even losing some limbs like an arm or a leg or something like that, that could make it difficult to find a job and definitely difficult to assimilate back into kind of normal life.
Sure, and that seems to kind of be the case here. We're introduced to a person named James Randall, who joined the Army at 18, so right out of high school, and deployed to the Middle East, which means he was sent as a soldier to the Middle East. The Middle East, where is that, Zach?
Well, we're talking about countries such as
Iraq and Saudi Arabia,
Right.
Iran, that area,
Afghanistan, yeah.
right?
Right.
Yeah. So he came home an alcoholic.
So, well, the first thing that struck me as important about this article was the fact that he joined the Army at the minimal age that you can join it, right at 18. So we are talking about a very young man, someone who's impressionable, someone who has some life experience, but not a whole lot. And so early on, he's entering adulthood in the Middle East. Now, that's a stark contrast between what he's probably used to.
Well, it's interesting because it tells us in the next paragraph that his addiction, so this alcoholism, led to his being discharged not only from the army but into the streets. Now, when we say someone is discharged from the military, we basically mean they are
They're let go.
Sometimes they're discharged because their time is finished, but basically they're released from the military, so they're no longer in the military. And here in this case, he's been discharged because he's an alcoholic. And so he's not only not in the military, he finds himself on the streets. And then it tells us a little bit more about his situation, right, Zach?
Yeah, for 2 years, he becomes homeless, sometimes drug-induced psychosis, and then even experienced being arrested.
So it says he was arrested more than 20 times, probably because of the drug-induced psychosis.
Sure.
What exactly is psychosis, Gabe?
What are you asking me for, son?
I'm asking you all the tough words, right?
With psychosis?
No, I'm just asking you what it is. I mean, it's basically what they're saying is you're
It's kind of psychotic things that you experience, hallucinations maybe because of the substances that you have been using,
there
like
you
drugs.
go. So basically, we're not saying the person is psychotic. They're behaving in a psychotic way because they're on the drugs.
But
right?
drugs obviously have a very strong effect that can cause unusual behavior.
Okay. Tells us then that after his last arrest, he decided to try to deal with the situation a little better. He went to King County Regional Veterans Court, which required that he be in treatment. So he found himself in treatment for
that's
the
great.
alcoholism.
Yeah, and the idea of someone being in treatment, that is perhaps they have decided to go to a rehab center, a place where they can get rehabilitation, to get recovery so that they can no longer be addicted to whatever it is they were addicted to. Now they're in treatment.
Okay, and so it says, only then did the idea of recovery cross his mind. So why did it cross his mind then? Well, because he was required to be in treatment. So he was kind of forced into it, but once he was forced into it, he kind of realized that it was an option. He says it had to be his choice because, of course, he had to take responsibility. He had to want to change, but the resources had to be offered. So this gave him an opportunity to get access to those resources, and so he was able to choose to change.
Well, and that seems to be kind of the ideal situation for someone who is seeking help, or for people working at a treatment center or a rehab place that participants or those that are there are kind of showing this sense of responsibility and a willingness just to say, I want to get better. I know it will be hard. I don't know how long it will take, but hopefully you have resources that I need.
Sure.
So if we were to just quickly review this story and look for the key points we can bring out of James Randall's experience, we would say, he came out of the Army as an alcoholic, and that led to sort of drug use, and he was homeless. But he wasn't just homeless because he didn't have a house. He was homeless because of all of these other problems that were involved. And sort of dealing with those problems wasn't just a matter of like giving him a house to live in. It was a matter of helping him deal with the problems first so that he could then make good use of other resources that were available to him. So just what we were talking about earlier, this idea that if a person is homeless, it might be very complicated. There might be reasons that they are homeless that need to be dealt with first.
And it is an interesting term we choose to describe. Obviously, it seems people are without a home, but home obviously is quite metaphoric for other things, a sense of stability,
Sure.
A sense of even
Like
purpose or
family
meaning,
or place,
families involved.
tied into all
right?
those things,
All of that's tied in there.
So that brings us to the next section, which was called Finding a Better Way. And they start this by saying that this story of James Randall should give all of us pause. Now, when something gives us pause, Gabe, what does that mean?
Should I give you a little pause before I respond?
No, don't just pause, because it's different from pausing. When you pause, you stop doing something briefly, temporarily. But
Right.
when it gives you pause,
Right. If something gives us pauses, it is pausing, but it's for the purpose of, kind of reconsidering what you're doing and reconsidering maybe your direction or something.
so it's like we see something or we read something that surprises us
Catches our attention.
so much that we have to think about it
Yeah.
before we're able to respond.
That's
So
great. I love movies and books that do that. They give us pause.
that's right. They then mention Seattle, and this is, of course, Doris's hometown. And they describe it as a city in crisis. Why is it in crisis? Well, because of this homeless problem. Now, why? There are a few reasons that Seattle has a homeless problem. Probably one of the most prominent is the weather, because Seattle never gets super cold, right? So I'm from Canada, and in Canada, the big city that has the homeless problem is Vancouver, because there's no snow, people aren't freezing during the winter.
Interesting.
And Seattle has very similar weather. And so part of it is sort of the area you're in. But nonetheless, what they tell us here is that Seattle is raising millions upon millions of dollars to end homelessness. And the implication there is that they're spending all this money to build houses to put homeless people in, right?
Right.
But then they go on to say that there is a worry. This is the writer says, but I worry that our focus is too much on buildings and not enough on rebuilding lives. Now, what's that mean, Zach?
Well, we're talking about specifically they're spending money. It seems like they've developed a budget to build a building, a physical building, to develop the infrastructure in order to house those without homes. But here we're saying there's not enough attention being spent on rebuilding lives, so providing an infrastructure for one's life to kind of grow, to develop. We're not talking about the physical building anymore, but rather the kind of pulling your life back together, getting things in order, helping people with those specific problems that kind of caused homelessness to begin with.
And so this is really where the opinion piece comes in here, because
That's true.
this is, of course, our opinion article. And the writer is saying, and actually says it very, very clearly in the next sentence, my hope is that when all this money is being dispersed, so dispersed just means being spent or given out. So as the government is spending all this money, the writer hopes a good chunk goes to treatment services. So a lot of that money should go into helping people deal with the problems that maybe contributed to their homelessness in the first place.
So specific treatment services like what? So we're talking about drug...
Perhaps rehab.
Okay, like
right?
drug rehabilitation.
Rehab is short for rehabilitation, which basically means like you're being treated for alcoholism or drug addiction. The
Maybe
organization...
talk therapy?
Well, the organization that I volunteered with, it had different services. It had sort of like treatment for alcoholism and drug use, but it also had things like sort of counseling services, and it offered a shelter so people could sort of stay there, maybe overnight, but also there were places they could stay for longer periods of time while they were in treatment programs. It included career training. In particular, they were training a lot of people to be property managers.
Interesting.
The reason being that usually property managers, it's like a person who works for an apartment building and kind of takes care of maintenance and stuff. Usually those people get free apartments. And so the person would have a job and a place to
stay.
live when they come out of this sort of treatment thing.
Sense of purpose that comes out of these services.
Yeah, they actually go on, the writer goes on here to say the different kinds of things that they hope these treatment services would give people. They say give people a sense of community, show them the potential they gave up long ago. So basically, help people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, right? They're part of a community, and help them see that they have potential to be something more than they are being right now. They could be something more.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a huge part of the problem is that people kind of give up on themselves. When someone's really young, we say this person has a lot of potential or they have a big future ahead of them. And then something like this happens. You come back from a war and you're an alcoholic and nobody's giving you a job and you're homeless and you just give up on yourself. But you do still have potential.
Yep. And I think recovery is such a positive solution to keep in mind. It was pointed out to me recently. Obviously, there is a pretty intense bottom where people can kind of spiral out of control. But there's also not necessarily, again, this is an opinion article, I'll express opinion of my own, there's not necessarily a ceiling on people's goodness and what people are capable of when their potential is actualized or realized.
So just to simplify what you're saying, Zach, you're saying we often know that things can always get worse.
Right.
But when we focus on that, we don't realize that things can also always get better and keep getting better.
And much better, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
That brings us to our next section, which actually focuses on this idea of living a new life. Listeners, you can find that on page 28. We're going to look at the right-hand column now.
Living a new life. Said Randall, to offer those resources would be awesome because most people don't know they exist. I was on the streets for 3 years, not even knowing where the shelter was. 2 years later, he's sober, a 4.0 student at Bellevue College, and a barista at Recovery Cafe, which facilitates recovery meetings. The healing starts, he said, and it's profound healing, like profound. Recovery Cafe founder Killian No urges people to stand on the side of love and tend to the inner needs of those in distress. If we want to get people out of all those tents that line our streets and sidewalks, we have to start by getting them out of the grip of addiction and into recovery.
So this section gives us more insight into that experience that James Randall said. We have a quote from James. He says, to offer those resources would be awesome because most people don't know they exist. I was on the street for 3 years, not even knowing where the shelter was.
Sounds like they need better advertising. Hey, our shelter's here. Come on over.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, though, right? When people are in sort of a world where they're being driven by alcoholism or drug use, they maybe are not particularly concerned with taking steps to improve their lives, right?
Sure. Even though maybe help is right in front of your eyes, but you're just kind of ignoring it.
Well, and I think that's probably why it was so important that he found himself in court that required him to be in treatment. Because sort of once he was in treatment and was sort of off the substances, not using the drugs or drinking or whatever, he could sort of see that there were other things going on and other options available maybe.
Yeah, his visibility really cleared.
Nonetheless, being involved in these programs, they basically helped him out and they showed him that he can actually do pretty well. He has a lot of potential, and it goes on to describe some of the things he's achieved since becoming sober. Sober, of course, can mean serious, but most of the time when we say it, we mean a person who is an alcoholic who is no longer drinking alcohol. So what has he achieved since becoming sober?
That's right. This is really interesting. He had a higher grade than I ever did in college. He was, sorry to give that away to everybody. I'm still qualified to teach here at Studio Classroom, but we read 2 years later, he's sober, a 4.0 student at Bellevue College, and a barista at Recovery Cafe.
Okay, so he's studying, and he's being a very successful student, right? He also has a job, so he's working in a coffee shop. And the cafe has a very interesting name. It's called Recovery Cafe, and it says it facilitates recovery meetings. So it's a coffee shop that is part of some sort of organization that's promoting sort of treatment for alcoholics and people with issues.
Right. And it seems maybe part and parcel to their process is the fact that they will hire people who were former alcoholics and they kind of get them a job, perhaps, and he can kind of then also share kind of his experience and offer his stories or his experiences to those that are also still in that recovery process, maybe kind of just starting out.
Yeah, sure. I really appreciate cities that allow this. I mean, I know, I guess specifically organizations that are trying to do this. You know, earlier we talked about not just providing a house for people, not just providing the buildings, but an organization like Recovery Cafe is actually trying to help people get back on their feet, as we would say, and get into normal life.
I really like the quote that follows this. This is, again, a quote from James Randall, that military veteran. I like it because the language he uses isn't very sophisticated. It's not very fancy, but you can almost you can sense the feeling kind of jumping off the page in it. It's a very powerful kind of quote. He says, "The healing starts, and it's profound healing, like profound." So he reiterates that it is profound. What does profound mean?
Profound is just it's significant.
So powerful that
And
it's
deep.
like life-changing,
Right.
right? So it's like once you start healing, you realize that you can heal more and more and more, and things can get better and better and better. And your whole world changes with that realization.
Pretty profound.
And just like exactly, it's very profound. And just like you said before, you know, the resources had to be offered, right? It's not just that he needed to go and get help. Of course, he needed to do his part, but it's also important for organizations like that to offer this kind of opportunity. And I think maybe there are some people that are skeptical of offering stuff because maybe people will take what they have offered and just go buy more drugs or go buy more alcohol or go do something else. So I do think it does take people who are both willing to do their part.
Well, we get a quote then from the person who founded the Recovery Cafe, who are just people to stand on the side of love, but maybe more importantly, to tend to the inner needs of those in distress. So this is, again, just kind of repeating and giving a review of this idea that you can't just give people the thing that they seem to need. You have to address the deeper issue. And they go on to say that if we want to get people out of all those tents that line our streets and sidewalks, because Seattle has a big homeless problem, we have to start by getting them out of the grip of addiction and into recovery. So again, you need to deal with those deeper issues. So yesterday, we ended with a challenge. We said, love your neighbors, right?
We did.
Think about people who might be lonely and think about how you might make their lives a little bit easier. Today, we maybe want to do the same thing. We want to say, as you're going about your day, think about the people who might have problems around you and think about how you might help them out with that. But today, we might add a word of caution. Be careful, because those problems can be complicated. Until next time, I'm Simon.
And I'm Zach.
I'm Gabe.
Saying goodbye. Join us again.
Bye-bye.